Go ahead, Maeve. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so how this will be sort of a little journey of speakeasy stories and myth and legends behind these stories in Albany. Got a little bit of Bethlehem in there as well. First, a little bit about who I am. So that's me, Maeve McEneny-Johnson. I work at the Discover Albany Visitor Center. If you don't know where that is in downtown Albany, next to the Old English Pub, connected to the Albany Pump Station. Currently, we are closed due to COVID, but we're still active. If you follow us on Facebook, you see we're promoting a lot of social distant fun things to do with your family. And we're just starting to do some tours there as well. Again, socially distant. At the end, we can talk about that as well. But here's what we're looking at with Prohibition, and we're just kind of do a basic overview. You know, we're starting in 1920 till 1933. It's in 1919 that the 18th Amendment is ratified. It's the Volstead Act that then is what enforces Prohibition, and it outlaws alcohol across the country, right? So it's not a state thing, it is a countrywide event. There's statistics in terms of how much alcohol is banned, that in Albany, which we're going to be talking about a lot, is they mention that sauerkraut, fermented sauerkraut, technically had more alcohol than what you were allowed to imbibe under Prohibition. You'll notice, though, that you can see Bethlehem could sort of see that this was coming. So there is a notice for the voters that to go dry, and they do indeed vote to go dry in preparation for what they saw the amendment. I'm assuming when they became a wet town again is when probably that 1933, when it's repealed by the 21st Amendment. So that's the range we're going to talk about, which makes it a little weird that I'm actually going to start talking about this fellow. This is a possible image of Henry Hudson. We don't actually know what Henry Hudson looked like, but this is what we imagine him to look like. And it's weird that I'm going to start with our early Dutch history. I find that when I started giving these talks, it was really hard to talk about it in a bubble. What does it mean to get rid of alcohol, just even in Albany and in Albany County? What does that mean? And culturally, we're pretty boozy. We're pretty boozy, and it actually goes back to these early Dutch. So I kind of want to talk about the Dutch and some of the culture and how the Dutch started thinking about alcohol and alcohol sales. Right, so this is just going to be your crash course, Albany history. You might remember it from your 4th grade class, right? Henry Hudson in 1609. He was English, but he was sailing for the Dutch. He's looking for the Northwest Passage, a shortcut to Asia for silks and spices. And he obviously gets lost because he ends up, coming up what we now call the Hudson River. He meets the Native Americans, and they do have something that he wants. It's the fur, right? It's this wonderful fur, the beaver fur in particular. So he brings this fur back to the Dutch, and the Dutch go crazy for it. They make these very stylish beaver felt hats. I can't say for sure those gentlemen in the picture are wearing a beaver hat, but you can kind of picture the style of what it would have been. They're almost like waterproof, and in Holland it can be kind of damp. So this was a big deal for the Dutch. So they come and they first settle in 1614, Fort Nassau, which was a bit of a disaster. So we'll kind of focus on 1624, Fort Orange. Before I go to the next slide, though, the quote you see is from a Dutch poet who was describing the people of Albany, that they all drink here from the moment they were able to lick a spoon. Right, so as you can see, this is culturally, and again, not terribly surprising, but this is very much, they're probably drinking like a near beer for the little ones. Beer has high calories, so some of these early settlers, has a practical purpose. But this gives you a sense of Fort Orange. This is our artist Len Tentillo. But the difference is when the Dutch come, so it looks like 1614 with Fort Nassau, remember 1620 is the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, right, so technically, right, we should have a Dutch Thanksgiving, I think, but technically, right, we have the Pilgrims coming. What are they fleeing? Religious persecution. And the Dutch, they're looking to settle for money. They want money. They are business people. This is fur trading. And this fella here, Kilian van Rensselaer, is the businessman behind all of this. So Kilian, he was the patroon. And patroons, I'm going to kind of oversimplify, but to incentivize colonists to come to the New World, they had this patroonship. A patroon was a person given land and granted certain privileges under the Dutch government, and it was like New York and some New Jersey. This was all Kilian van Rensselaer's idea, so it's not surprising that the Rensselaer patroonship is the one that lasts close to 2 centuries, 1630 to 1839. Okay, but what does this have to do with beer? Right, okay, I'm going to get there, right? So remember, he's a businessman, and he has a background of pearls and diamonds, but he already recognizes the value of alcohol, which nobody had really done yet in our part of the world. He looks in 1632, he writes a letter to the Dutch West India Company, where he says, as soon as there's a supply of grain on hand, I intend to erect a brewery in New Netherland with beer. So then at his own expense, and he says, I will take all full risk, they set up this brewery, and he says, you know, feel free to sell it to the Native Americans, feel free to sell it to the other colonists, but it is the first brewery, like, so it's not just people in their homes brewing, this is the first time that this beer is used to make money. Now, he's got a hold on this till about 1643, he passes away, and conveniently, other people start doing this, right? Nobody wanted to go up against Kilian, but once he's gone, it's fair game. So by 1660, there are 8 breweries in Albany. I think in Colonial Williamsburg, right, that's the one that everyone looks at Colonial, there's like 1, maybe 2. So, you know, if you look back at that Len Tentillo, right, the fact that like these brewers are coming is pretty remarkable to me. All right, so I'm just giving you that kind of baseline that we can see the economic value of alcohol. So now I'm jumping, right? Now we're gonna jump to the 19th century, and we're talking about our brewers still. We have in the 19th century now like 11 breweries. We have Irish and German. The Germans are usually the ones brewing, but the workers tend to be Irish. It's kind of a simplification, but generally that's what you will find. One of these brewers is John Taylor's and Sons. At its height, 200,000 barrels of beer a year is produced out of this brewery, and it is called Albany Ale. Albany Ale across the country is known as the best beer. Why? Because it's really, really strong. So Albany Ale becomes this catch-all term for really, really good beer. Broadway and Arch, you probably know that building. It's not the same building, but it's the similar, if not the same footprint. If you're down by where the Dutch Apple Cruise is and the USS Slater is, where the U-Haul truck, where it has the truck on the roof, that's where the Taylor Brewery would have been. So it's incredible, right? This is our reputation, and we have now 11 breweries, and here comes Prohibition, right? That's it. Some of them were able to pivot a little bit. They could do, some of them were ice houses. I think some of them got into ice cream, a little bit of like a soda pop. But once Prohibition is repealed, there are only 3 that still hang around. And some of our folks who have been in Albany for a while might know some of these classic Albany beers. So just a moment so that you're not surprised when we get to some of the little quiz questions. If you want to go in the chat, and if you could tell me uh, one, or if you really want to impress us, three of those brewers who were still around after Prohibition in Albany. Michelle, when you're ready, you can just read some of them out.
So we have so far Quinn and Nolan, question mark.
Yeah, they didn't quite make it.
C.H. Evans.
Not so they closed. C.H. Evans would close during Prohibition in Hudson, but Neil Evans, it was his family name. He took that family name and he moved it to Albany. I think back in the 90s. Somebody can fact check that.
So we have Schaefer, question mark.
We're getting a little closer.
Evans Hendrick.
Somebody got Hedricks. Dobler. And actually, the Beverwick. So
right.
Somebody might fact check me because it might have been Quinn and Nolan turned into Beverwick. All right, put a pin in that one. I'm going to have to look that one up. So you'll get my email at the end of this. So anything I get wrong, if I don't see it in the chat, you can go right ahead and send it right over to me. Right. So, but that's still pretty incredible, right? When you think about, the 11 breweries. I mean, this was a huge industry for us, and in part, you can see these boats by the Taylors, right, because of the Erie Canal. That was Quinn and Nolan figured that out. That in a lot of I wish I took a picture. You'll see their advertisements, and they will have the beautiful brewery, but in the background you see the river with the boat. And then, you can see this here. It wasn't Prohibition that totally killed our brewing industry. I do want to preface that. Once popularity shifted from the canal over to trains, that's like what poor Taylor and Sons. But still, at the end of it, we have 3 breweries left. And how did some of them make it after Prohibition? It wasn't just selling ice and soda pop. So we'll get to that a little bit later. So Albany, though, as you can imagine, all right, so Prohibition comes in, and it's not particularly popular, not just in Albany, but really across the country. The reason Prohibition came about is, there was, a lot of it was the women's movement. There was a lot of, stories of men who were coming home work and, they were abusing their women. And some of these women said, the alcohol is fueling a lot of that anger. There's a whole host of other reasons. Frankie Bailey's book, Wicked Albany, Frankie Bailey and Alice Green, talks a lot about some of the social things that were going on around Prohibition. So Albany's not terribly into it. We have a temperance movement. It's not terribly strong. So I can give you some statistics about what happens in the case of public drunkenness. Right? So 1919, we have 1,037 people arrested for public drunkenness. But then Prohibition comes in. 1920, 477 are arrested. So it seems like we're doing a good thing here. In 1921, 660. So here is our first quiz question. Whoops. Oh, did it not come through? By 1924, what do the numbers for public intoxication look like in Albany? Do you think A, that it hit an all-time low, we finally figured this out and we embraced it? B, it's an all-time high, we get as close to 4,000? Or do you think it's remaining the same, that we actually kind of fell back into that 1919 number? So if you'll put A, B, or C in the chat.
it looks like everybody's responded that's going to. And the verdict is B.
Is all-time high? Yes, it would be a really boring talk if it were A. Yes. 4,118 people were arrested for public intoxication. And why? And that is our speakeasies, right? This is a picture from Kenbrick Mansion, which was not a speakeasy. If we have time, I've got a great Prohibition-related story to them a little later. According to William Kennedy, right, it is said that all you needed to create a speakeasy was 2 bottles in a room, and Albany had hundreds. Now, I caught that my dad signed in on the chat, so I'm gonna throw him under the bus a little bit. This is in Albany that I got a lot of these names, and yet this part of Albany where Kennedy is getting all of these names, he says, according to Jack McEneny, and then there's this long list. I didn't even include them all. So I don't know who my dad was talking to that he got all of these names. But the thing is a lot of times people, when I give this talk, they're like, where were the speakeasies? Or they'll tell me about their grandmother who had a, you walked inside your house and every time you opened the front door, the basement light would turn on. The thing about a speakeasy is it's secret. Right? So this is the hardest thing about giving this talk is trying to find where these places were and how much of them are legend and how much of them are fact. And that's the part where it gets murky, how much of this is word of mouth. And that's sort of the fun of Albany is Kennedy really embraces kind of the rumor and the gossip and leaves it up to you. What makes it, what's history and what's just a really good story. And speakeasies in Albany have a lot of that. But you can see some of the ones listed here. And they are, there are the way, you think of Albany, you have your German neighborhood, you have your Irish neighborhood, but it does seem like the speakeasies, you didn't necessarily frequent your own neighborhood, and maybe you wouldn't want to because you wouldn't want your neighbors to see you doing something really, really illegal, right? So you can see they get kind of scattered all over. And a lot of them are just somebody's name. So, some of those stories where you hear about a brownstone, in the Mansion District in Albany had a secret bar. Well, yeah, maybe, I could see that's true. You'll see O'Connor's at the top there. O'Connor's was the biggest speakeasy and probably the most popular. And the bar was actually bought from the original Tammany Hall. And when Smith's Tavern opened in Cohoes, which you can see the picture there, they took that bar. So if you want to have your own little kind of like genuine speakeasy moment, that is a genuine piece that we know comes from Albany Prohibition history. The other thing about speakeasies, which is what made them so scandalous, right, is the one thing when you walked in the door, there's a little bit of an equality going on because you're all doing something wrong. You're all doing something bad. So there is this equalizing when you're coming in, and the women get a little bolder, and you're gonna cut your hair and wear your skirt shorter, and you're gonna have your drinks that are illegal and listen to music that your parents would be absolutely horrified by. So there is something pretty interesting about that culturally going on. And again, I recommend Wicked Albany if you want to learn a little bit more about that. Another piece of Prohibition history still standing, listed at the bottom, Pauley's Hotel is still in business. You can still go and visit there. Not yet. So what are we gonna, all right, so now we're at the speakeasy, right? So we have decided, we have snuck out, we're at the speakeasy. What are we going to drink at this speakeasy? Traditionally, what we all know is, right, the liquor. Liquor is pretty easy to make. Good liquor is not, but we were worried about that, right? We're not worried about that. We are just, the bathtub gin, right? And when we say bathtub gin, it was legitimately made in bathtubs. So a lot of our modern recipes that were sent with the chat, where these really interesting gin cocktails with sugars and whatnot, a lot of those were made to hide how terrible the bathtub gin was. So when you look at those eras and you're seeing all the different ingredients, think about that, that it really was to try to hide that. And the smell, it was the other thing too. It smelled bad, it tasted bad, so how do you hide that and still have a good time? The one thing without, oversight though, is a lot of these drinks could be deadly, right? They could actually be deadly. There's stories of people adding lye and industrial alcohol to add color and give it a kick, whatever that means. There were multiple deaths reported on account of contaminated alcohol, and city officials were struggling to try to control this. The Knickerbocker Press reported that poison whiskey was being made in 200 places in Albany. And the article included a warning from doctors to avoid all colored concoctions. And that confused me at first. I was like, well, why would that make a difference? And then I thought about when I looked at my gin drink, which is like clear outside of, I put a little lime juice in it. And I got to my college kid logic of like, oh yeah, right? Like if it's bad, just put a lot of orange juice in it, you won't taste it. So, that also might have been another thing, is we'll get into some of those other types of drinks, like the whiskeys, but maybe why gin was so popular is you could literally see the quality of it. There's moonshine. You might have heard of moonshine as well. Again, I didn't know my dad was going to be on the chat, so he's gonna keep getting thrown under the bus. But a local story for us growing up, and I think it's great to tell because it does kind of give you a sense culturally of what was going on with the people who were pro-prohibition. So my grandfather is World War I. So a lot of people say, really? No, trust us. He was a World War I vet, and he was young when he was sent overseas, and he caught the influenza, the Spanish flu, in 1918. He survived, obviously, and he came back to work at his old job, which would have been a desk job. And they said that is the absolute worst thing you can do for your recovery. You cannot do that. You need to do something active. You need to build your lungs back up. So he finds work with an Adirondack surveying team. So as I understand that, like lumberjacks, right? So, pardon me for getting political, but he is a mild-mannered Democrat, and he is with these very strict North Country Republicans. And at the end, they all kind of hang out at the end of the day, and they've got a big old jug of moonshine. And they are passing that around, and they are talking about how great Prohibition is, with no more taverns. We're keeping the sin, out of our town, and they're getting really drunk, right? So finally, my grandfather is like completely baffled, and he's like, "You're such hypocrites. So what do you mean? Like, you are all drunk talking about the evils of alcohol," and they're just like, "What? No. We're talking about store-bought whiskey. What you make at home is fine." And it kind of makes you think back to the Dutch, right? Like, if you think about that, the Dutch, when those colonists were coming over, they were all making their beer at home. And then in comes Kilian Van Rensselaer, and then nobody opens a brewery until he dies. So there is, when they talk about some of the people who are pro-prohibition, it isn't necessarily about getting drunk, but it's some of the sales and the taverns as well. We spent a lot of time talking about beer. They were serving beer. So, you could make it at home. Kennedy talks about a guy who ran a speakeasy. He said his system was to make only 3 or 4 half barrels at a time, boil it, ferment it 4 or 5 days, let it stand 2 weeks to be decent, and then sell it 5 cents a glass. It was clear, like the beer of today. Now, I guess that's like Coors Light. I don't know, but it doesn't sound terribly appetizing. I find, Craig Gervina, who's the beer historian, and he gets all incensed about Prohibition and beer, but part of it is he finds it, even though Kennedy says that seems to be what was most popular in Albany, and then Craig is saying, it's so labor intensive to brew beer. I don't know if I agree with Craig, but he is totally flummoxed by this. But we do know that there was some organized beer trafficking from New Jersey via the gangster Waxy Gordon. All right, so we are at our speakeasy, as we said. Now we know that there's some dodgy drinks. So we have just been served our drink. Here is our next question. How do we find out if this drink is viable? And this was some advice that was given by a bootlegger. All right, so here's our drink. How to test if your bathtub gin is poisonous. Do you sip it and swirl it in your mouth and spit it out like you would a wine? Do you let the dog taste it first and see how that goes? Or do you set it on fire? And you can put those ABC in the chat.
Wow, people really seem to know this one.
Ooh.
They all think it's set it on fire.
Yes. Yes. I will put a disclaimer on behalf of Discover Albany and the Bethlehem Library that we will not verify whether this is actually a real way. So if you do this and you are poisoned, this isn't on us. But yes, supposedly what you are meant to do is you pour it on the curb, you light it. If it turns blue, you can drink it. If it turned yellow, you threw it away or you took the risk of going blind. This particular bootlegger said that he never actually saw anybody throw it out, though. So who knows? I don't know if they went blind, but nobody was throwing it out. Great. That is my grandmother. If people are saying like, really, like what is she talking about? So, you know, that is not, I did not Google image flapper. That's actually what I was trying to do. And then I was like, oh wait, no, I have on my shelf a lovely picture of my grandmother. Entertainment, right?
They
So
sent it, I guess, earlier, but I can't.
what are people doing for fun? Well, so the Palace Theater opened in 1931. So, right, this is the later half of Prohibition. But there was a lot of vaudeville, and if you might have to squint to look in, you can see that they have a couple of vaudeville acts there on the marquee. But, of course, burlesque is what would be, you know, if you were really kind of have the full experience, you would try to find a burlesque show. But burlesque shows would be quite scandalous. And, you know, eventually, too, where burlesque was more about a tease, you know, then, like, they start turning more towards, you know, the strip tease and the leg show. But you could have gone to the Empire, which was on State Street. That is where you would suffer through Snuffy Cabman and Slidey Billy Watson while you waited for Molly Williams to do the hula hula and the dance of enticement. Now, ladies were invited to go to the Empire, and some say they really went. But were they ladies? Now, of course, my grandmother, looking at her, she was definitely a lady. She never would have gone to a show like that. But think about that as well, you know, where a lot of these saloons before Prohibition and taverns, yeah?
What does RKO mean?
Oh,
Sorry to take you off track.
no, off the top of my head, radio, I bet somebody in the chat would know. Hold on. I can look it up. It is, nope. I would have to, at the end of it, I'll take a look. That's something I should have had at the tip of my tongue. I bet if you asked me pre-COVID, I would have remembered, but but yeah, I'll make sure at the end that I'll look that up. But it was like, yeah, but it was live performances, and then for a little while there was movie screenings when that was available as well. But yes, so this was the other thing about speakeasies, where before Prohibition, women did not go to bars, women did not go to saloons, and if you were a woman seen there, it was, you know, it was not great for your reputation. So this was the other thing that was really exciting at the time, is to be able to go to some place like the Empire. Yes. Oh, you're on mute.
somebody said it was Radio Keith Orpham?
Yep, that sounds right. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. So, you know, that women were now, not only were you like encouraged to be like, you know, cut your hair, wear short skirts, dance, smoke, drink, and you could go to see maybe a, you know, titillating show. And so that was something that was a really incredible thing that was happening during this time, is women got to break the rules. There was also the Kenmore Hotel, and the Kenmore Hotel still stands. It's interesting in this postcard, it's white, but if you go see it in person, it's red. Now, it was actually first opened in 1878 by Adam Blake, who is fascinating. I hope someone does some Adam Blake lectures at some point. He was the son of a freed enslaved man who was also named Adam Blake. And he worked at another hotel, which would have been just down the street, called the Delavan, as a waiter. And he worked himself up, and he was able to buy up property and businesses. And he was like the first really successful, rich African-American in Albany. And he's fascinating. And he opens up, eventually, the Kenmore Hotel, which still stands today. It's starting to be rented out for apartments. It's also going to be a wedding venue as well. He dies in 1881, and then his widow is running the Kenmore. But in the time of Prohibition, it is the Murphy family, Robert Murphy, who runs the Kenmore, and he's really proud of the Rainbow Room nightclub. The Rainbow Room nightclub was a lot of premier acts coming, a live radio broadcast. You could dance the night away, which made it a very popular spot from probably the most infamous Albany gangster, Mr. Legs Diamond. Now, here's one thing that when we talk about the Albany Prohibition story, and let's compare it to, say, Chicago, you won't see the same kind of organized violence, I should say, at the hands of these gangsters, right? We don't have an Al Capone. Troy's a little more organized, but at the end of the day, it's not happening here. And is it because we're not desirable? Well, no, you saw that we have a history in this region for not only being a boozy town, but, you know, we're pretty centrally located to a lot of easy access and this river. So why aren't these guys trying to get a hold of it? And we'll get to that in a moment. But Mr. Diamond, he sees this opportunity, and he starts showing his face in Albany. Let's talk about who he is, though, right? I'll give you a little background on him. So his real name was Jack Moran. He's Irish American. He gets the name Legs, again, Prohibition, a lot of different stories about it. One of them is that he was a great dancer, and he loved going to places like the Rainbow Room, so he got the name Legs. The other is that you couldn't knock him off his legs. His other nickname was the Clay Pigeon of the underworld. Nobody could kill him for a really long time, as you can see from his birth date, right? Doesn't have a long life. But man, did people try for a long time. There's at least like 5 attempts on his life. And all of these were not like a graze on the shoulder. I mean, he should have died from at least one of them. And he'd be like, I just drank too much, is what he said to one doctor. Like, how'd you survive this? I just drank and made my way to the hospital and I was fine. He has a rival by the name of Dutch Schultz. And Dutch Schultz says, you know, there's nobody that can shoot this guy down so he won't bounce back. Yeah, he's incredible. So Legs starts showing up around Albany. And he's got a lawyer by the name of Dan Pryor. And he's with Dan, and he's, you know, showing his face. And at this point, we know who he is. But he's like, no, I'm just doing business, insurance business. But everybody knows what he's up to. And he's being told by Albany police officers, you cannot show your face in Albany. You cannot be here. It's like, I can do business. I can do what I want. So there was out in Catskill, there was a man named Grover Parks who was in what Legs considered was his territory. And he had a cart full of Applejack, which would be like hard cider, right? And he's caught by Diamond. Diamond kidnaps him. He tortures him. But at some point, the gang kind of gets away from him, and Parks is able to escape, and he gets help. So Legs is arrested, and this seems like it's going to be an open and shut case, right? We got him, and he's tried in the Troy courthouse. I mentioned Pryor. So I believe, I don't think my mouse comes up, but if you look at the left picture, you'll see all these fellas kind of like crowded around the table that's in the middle. I think Pryor is the one who's holding his head up like this, looking exhausted. And Legs is the one, there's a man with white hair, and he's to the left, and he's a little exhausted. He's a little like this. So that's at the Troy courthouse. And then I'm not just being egotistical because it's my wedding and it's a beautiful picture, but that's the mansion at Cedar Hill. Some of you locals may know it. And that is, used to be Governor Glynn's summer house, but then it was bought by Legs Diamond's lawyer, Pryor. And they would come here, and Pryor lived there full time, and this is where they would kind of scheme and talk before going down to the Troy courthouse. But you can see, like, this is a pretty tense situation in there, right? And there are some legends, again, whether they're true or not, I don't know, it's a Prohibition legend, that Legs on his way to the courthouse would have 20, just pass them out on the street, no big deal. I don't know about you, but if I were there today, if somebody gave me a 20 on the street, I'd be pretty happy. In 1931, I cannot imagine. So shockingly, Legs is found not guilty. You would think you would party it up in Troy, but Legs decides, no. I'm going back to Albany. That's where all my favorite speakeasies are. So, he does make an appearance at the Kenmore Hotel. He has a great time there. He goes to a speakeasy on State Street, and he kind of parties it up there for a little bit. He's with his gang and his wife. He leaves his wife, Alice, at the speakeasy, gets in a car with some of his buddies, goes to 21 Kenbrick Street, where he goes to see his girlfriend, Kiki Roberts, who was a showgirl. And he stays at Kiki's till about 4 in the morning. And then they drive to a flop house at 67 Dove Street. Legs is so drunk he can barely stand. They have to basically carry him up the stairs. They have to basically undress him, and they just throw the boss on the bed. Like, we'll deal with him in the morning. So the two men leave. Shots are fired in the middle of the night. And then two other men have rushed out. So the two gang members have long left. So when they look out the window, there's these two other men who suddenly run out. They actually pause for a moment and they say, oh, do you think we have to go back and do it again? Because remember, he's the clay pigeon. No. Out they go. So Legs is found dead in the morning. This is not, you see, Bethlehem. It is not our Bethlehem, unfortunately. It was a coincidence. But this was, I believe, Pennsylvania. So really caught people's imagination. You could see wife and several girls and the rooming mistress deny they know the slayers. And so 67 Dove is there to the left. So as I understand it, the woman who would have rented was downstairs, and Legs would have been upstairs. Today, William Kennedy owns the home. So this was the Albany mystery now. Who did it? Who shot Legs Diamond? And there were a lot of people, as you can see just in that headline, who could have been suspects, right? So, you have Dutch Schultz, who's seen him as a rival. And that's what the general consensus was from the police in the city. They said, well, yeah, it was another gangster. Other people said, well, come on, the police wouldn't want anything to do with Diamond hanging around here. It had to be them. But what about Alice? Alice was left at the speakeasy so he could go see his showgirl girlfriend. And then he's got a showgirl girlfriend, and you know how they are, right? Showgirls. Like, who knows, right? Who did it? So here is our last quiz question. Who killed Legs Diamond? So you have the Albany police, who's there. That's Alice Diamond, and there is Legs, one of the times he was shot, where she's by his bedside. There's the lovely Kiki. Maybe they worked together. That was a theory. And then there's Dutch Schultz, his mugshot. What's it looking like?
I think it was the Dutch Schultz.
Oh, so we think it was the rival gangster.
Because he was a brutal, brutal fellow.
He was brutal. He was absolutely brutal. And, you know, sounds funny for me to say go to Wikipedia, but go to Wikipedia afterwards and you can read about him. And yeah, he's pretty brutal. And that was pretty much what people said, right? That was easy enough. But then, you know, some things just kind of weren't adding up. There were some reporters who claimed that they were tipped off pretty early on when this happened, but they wouldn't say who tipped them off. That was kind of odd. And Kennedy, he's like a young reporter, and he's hearing all these little rumors and stories, and he becomes obsessed with Legs. He really becomes obsessed with him. He writes, there's a fiction book, Legs, that he wrote, and he just decides he wants to figure this out, and he starts interviewing all these different like old police officers, and he starts, after he published the fiction book, he was getting weird calls. There was a man who called him up and said, "Sir, Mr. Kennedy, I know who did it. I know who did it." And Kennedy was like, "Okay, I'll meet you." And they meet face to face. And this man is older, he's racked with guilt, and he says, "I did it." "Oh, you did it?" "Yes. I was 4 years old. I was 4 years old, and I was at a speakeasy with my parents, and there was a gun, and I was playing with the gun as a 4-year-old, and it went off, and I shot Legs Diamond in the chest. My family wanted to protect me. They went, and when the police were looking, there was a car. They hid the car, and they did it to protect me." And Kennedy's like, "Okay, you know Legs was shot in the head, right?" The man just kind of gets very serious. He goes, "Okay, maybe it wasn't Legs, but it was somebody. I shot somebody when I was 4 in a speakeasy." This is what poor William Kennedy is trying to chase. But eventually he gets an interview. He gets an interview with Dan O'Connell. And Dan O'Connell, for some of you who've been around a while, Dan O'Connell was the head of the Democratic machine. His official title was the city assessor, but he really was the one behind Mayor Corning, kind of the inner workings. He was over his shoulder. And as an old man, he went into like a reclusive period, but William Kennedy gets the interview. And he's like, "This is it. But he knows he's gonna really have to like get this out of him, right? You know, it's gonna be a tough conversation." And he goes, "Okay, Dan, I gotta ask you, who shot Legs?" And he's like, "We did it. Yeah. Fitzpatrick pulled the trigger, but we did it." Fitzpatrick is the officer that you see in this picture here to the left, as far as I could tell from what I was looking up. And so think about it, right? So why did the police get involved in this way? Well, as Dan is saying, and many of the police officers under him, that kind of organized crime, they said, wasn't here. We didn't have it. We didn't have an Al Capone. When people like Legs Diamond were coming in, we snuffed it out. And that seems very noble. However, there are images of like Albany police kind of helping bootleggers along, fixing their tires. There is a story, also a Jack McEnany story, where they talk about there was a precinct that, they took illegal booze into one of the police stations, and then magically in the morning a miracle happens and all of it turned to water. How did that happen? And then, funny enough, Dan O'Connell is the owner of Hendrick's Brewery. And that was the brewery post-Prohibition where you had to carry in your bar everywhere in Albany, everywhere, or you didn't get a liquor license. So, that's the thought. Now there's two sides of the coin, right? Where, and again, the economics of booze. There is the practical purpose. There's the practical purpose of keeping the Legs Diamond riffraff out. We have a lot of fun talking about Legs, but if you look him up, he's pretty terrible. Dutch Schultz, they are terrible, violent people. And then, we're keeping them out. But then there's the other side, this economics, right? And we sure had a lot of speakeasies. And there is no way that these police didn't know what was going on. Fitzpatrick, his full story is laid out in Albany. I won't go into the full bit because I would love you to go to the Bethlehem Library and check out Albany. But Fitzpatrick is the only police chief in the city of Albany who is killed in his office. He is shot in his office by another police officer. So you will have to pick up Albany to figure out the full story that Kennedy believes behind that. But that is a terrible note to end on, so I wanted to end on one happy Prohibition story before we wrap up. I'm on the board of Kenbrick Mansion. It's a great, beautiful mansion built in 1798 by General Tenbrook, so it's got a Revolutionary War story to it. But the Alcott family it's their family home until the Albany County Historical Association takes over the home in like the late 40s into 50s. And Thomas Alcott, who is the patriarch of that family, has a son, Dudley Alcott. And Dudley Alcott is a 19th century wine connoisseur. And he makes his money selling wine. And there is a wine cellar that was built in the basement that had some really wonderful vintages that, of course, somebody who loves wine would collect. Now, when Prohibition, moves in, they were grandfathered in that nobody would seize your alcohol, but things changed so fast that the families didn't want to take the chance, and they lock it up. They lock up this wine cellar. So the Historical Association is gifted this mansion, and it's a great thing until the 70s. Historic houses are really expensive to maintain. They are so expensive, and the Historical Society has no money. They have absolutely no money, and it's looking like they're going to have to sell the mansion. Now, this wine cellar is, and again, Prohibition stories, this is what I find so funny because this story took place way back in the 1970s. I cannot tell you how many different versions of this wine cellar I have heard. I have heard that it was bricked over and a magic brick fell and you could look in and see the wine bottles. I have heard that it was locked and they had to jam it open. But here is what we have since figured out. On the Tenbrook board was a man named Colonel Henne, who was very temperance. He was teetotaler. He did not believe in the consumption of alcohol. And he pretty much said, ignore it. Don't open that door. Nope, nope. And how many people knew that there was wine in there or not, but out of respect for him, they did not open it. He passes away, and they wait 6 months before they, out of respect for him, to open up this door. And they open up and the wine cellar is re-revealed, but it's not just any wine cellar. It still has viable wine back from Dudley Alcott's day. In particular, there was a year where there was a grape blight in France, and it was very rare to get these bottles anywhere in the world. And we had them. And they were protected because this wine cellar was locked up. So they did bring in someone to price the bottles, some of them very, very special. And in some cases today, even the labels are really special. There's actually a documentary, I think on Netflix, about a guy who was stealing these old labels to then counterfeit this wine. So we now have to be really protective of that, of people taking pictures. But we were able to auction off some of the rare bottles, kept a few for ourselves, and that auction saved Kenbrick Mansion. And so that's just kind of, one thing of that Prohibition helped preserve this really special thing, because I am absolutely sure that if that wine cellar was unlocked, it would have been long drunk. It would have been long, Prohibition or not, that would have been long, long emptied. So that's it, because I know. Oh, and actually the legacy of Prohibition, or post-Prohibition continues. Now we have craft beverage everywhere. On another lecture, I can tell you about how craft beverage as we know it today actually started in Albany because of a Mr. Bill Newman. So all those fancy Sam Adams that you see, he was educated by Bill Newman in Albany before craft beverage was a thing. But now we have distilleries back. The Albany Distilling Company is the first one open since Prohibition. C.H. Evans closed during Prohibition in Hudson, reopened in Albany. We have the New York's first farm cidery, the Real McCoy, we've got mead. A lot of very cool things have happened. So that identity that we talked about in those early Dutch, you can kind of see we're going back to those early roots. If you want to learn more, I am doing a tour with beer historian Craig Gravina. The way tours work in COVID right now is they can only be per household. So we do have one on Eventbrite. If you get to be that household, it's all you. But if you email me and you say, oh, I couldn't make it that night, we'll work something out. We'd love to give you a tour and talk about our wonderful boozy history. Here is the bibliography, and if my father's still on the chat, I am out of the will because I forgot to put in Capital City on the Hudson by Jack McEneny. Sorry about that, but Dad is quoted heavily in O Albany, which is why I think I can get away with it. But here are some of the different books that you can take a look at. Nebraska Brace is not Prohibition specific. It's a wonderful name, but it is, you can kind of see how, a lot of these stories, I give you a timeline, but things don't happen in a bubble. So Nebraska kind of has a little bit of those old Prohibition echoes that are kind of slowly still in the city, but then kind of working their way out. All right, that's it. Let me see if I can come on back, see you all. All right. And if there's any questions, I'll see if I can find the chat. If not, Michelle will tell me. Ah, there we go.
Would you mind if anyone wasn't comfortable typing if they unmuted and asked a question?
Yeah, please, if you would like to. I miss human beings. I'd love to hear some voices. If anyone has any questions or comments.
Great talk.
Thank you. Oh, so yes, I did forget to mention Speakeasy 518. That was actually the first picture that I put up, and I forgot to mention it. So Speakeasy 518 is a currently operating speakeasy, but with a modern twist. The City Beer Hall, which is on Lodge and Howard, right, is a very popular place to go. And down below, there's a door. There is no sign on the door. You have to knock on the door. There's like a red light. This is how you know it's open. There's a red light. You knock on the door, and somebody will come out, either a guy with suspenders and he looks stern, or a beautiful woman in like a flapper dress, and they will say to you first, "Hi, why are you here?" And you say, "I'm here for the speakeasy," and then you're invited in. They do live music, toward, I think at the end, well, of course this was, before COVID, but it's live music, specialty cocktails. They were doing a deal with City Beer Hall with COVID where you could actually pick up some of these great cocktails. And it's a really cool, special place. What I'm trying to figure out from them is apparently where Howard and Lodge was an old garage where some of the rum runners would actually pull in, and I'm really excited to tell them that because I don't think they know that, how close they were. So yeah, they're operational. But I would kind of keep an eye out with COVID because it's a small, intimate space. So most of their partnership has been with City Beer Hall right now.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop the recording, but please feel free to continue with questions.